Nations, both past and present, have lauded and valorized military service. But such service also produces disability, causing tremendous damage to bodies and minds through injury, disease, and traumatic experience. War routinely takes the young and temporarily able-bodied and furnishes them with disabilities. And this has happened as long as warfare has existed. War produces disability. Because society celebrates the nation's military valor and accomplishments, showing gratitude for military service, this compels recognition of an obligation to help veterans, particularly those with disabilities. So there's a tension between the celebration of soldiers and the reality of war's consequences. And in this way, disabled veterans have played an important role in generating attention for people with disabilities, because by celebrating the importance of military service, society must acknowledge a debt owed to those who suffered from it. So let's reflect on the U.S. Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865. And this left more than 620,000 dead and 1.5 million people wounded. In the midst of the war, in order to address manpower shortages, President Abraham Lincoln authorized the creation of the Invalid Corps in 1863. And in this, some 20,000 men served. Now, these were men who had been wounded as a result of their military service, and they were to be used in non-frontline, non-combat duties. And this is such as guarding prisoners or protecting railroad lines or serving as an urban guard. But all of these duties were routinely dangerous and even included combat against the enemy. Now, despite the service that sent men into the Corps and the duties that they fulfilled while in it, soldiers in the Invalid Corps were subjected to prevailing cultural bias. Their fellow soldiers viewed them as cowards and slackers who sought to avoid military service. And making matters worse, the initials IC, standing for Inspected Condemned, was used by the Army to denote defective military gear or spoiled military provisions, from bullets to food. And thus, soldiers in the Invalid Corps were regularly called pejoratively condemned Yanks, inspecteds, or even the Cripple Brigade. The war left an estimated 45,000 people with amputated limbs, stimulating the development of accommodation devices to improve accessibility, and patents spiked after the Civil War for new adaptive devices and technological innovations. The first wheelchair patent was issued in 1869, just after the Civil War, and there were improved prosthetic devices and canes and glass eyes and so forth because of the scale of the need, which served veterans, but also other people with disabilities. And the U.S. government set up homes for destitute veterans and offered disability compensation for veterans who could not return to manual labor after the war, with 400,000 people requesting compensation in the decades following the war. Now, to be eligible, medical verification was required, and this reflects the emerging professionalization of the medical establishment, which we discussed in a previous video, and the medicalization of disability. Yet, the process to receive the benefits was not an easy one, and some lacked the time and the money and the perseverance to seek them out. And African American veterans faced the obstacle of racism, which further hindered their access for disability support. And finally, it should be noted that non-visible disabilities were even less likely to receive compensation. With each successive American conflict, World War I, World War II, the conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, a wave of soldiers returned with disabilities, and each pushed for resources to support disabled veterans, and that in time would help other people with disabilities. To advocate, veterans formed disability-specific organizations, such as the Blind Veterans Association or the Disabled American Veterans. And this created community and supported camaraderie, promoted fellow help, and pressured the government for support. But note that they created these because they felt that the general veterans organizations did not sufficiently advocate for the needs of disabled veterans. Now, after World War I, advocates began to emphasize their rights as citizens who served the country, and the goal for veterans to again become productive members of society by securing employment. So the federal government provided rehabilitation and vocational programs starting in 1918, and 150,000 veterans utilized these programs, which were expanded in 1920 to the non-veteran disabled community. Rehabilitation was specifically presented with the goal of gaining employment. But they still faced the bias of a society that did not want to see them. Getting hired was a different matter from getting trained. Cultural stigma against disability persisted, but this was at least tempered by the military service, which helped increase awareness and move ever so slightly the needle of understanding.